So welcome everyone. This is my first webinar with Joanna, and I am so excited. Um, is Sometimes I think it's difficult for me to find people that I can be comfortable with, but I am really, really comfortable with Joanna. I admire her work. She understands my work, which I know is not for everyone because I talk a lot about behavior and behavioral science. And at times it can sound like I'm trying to program people, but that's not at all what I do.
Mm-mm.
So I'm excited to have everyone here. The conversation today is about the intersection between an inclusive culture, which is what I do, and effective HR governance and leadership, which is what Joanna does. So I have a quick agenda. It's going to be interactive. Hopefully, there are some questions. First, we're going to talk about culture redesign and what we do. Then I'm going to let Joanna, I'm going to invite her to talk about her work. She has a lot of experience in many different areas. And I think when a person has really all that expertise, their input is just so relevant. And then we're going to talk about how an intention of having a great culture is a good starting point, but it's not until you build an infrastructure in the company that you are able to sustain that positive change. And then we're going to go into questions and answers. We're going to open it for the audience if you guys want to ask questions. And if not, we also have some questions that came in through the newsletter. So a little bit about us, Culture Redesign. We are not traditional consultants. We do traditional things like organizational behavior and organizational leadership, but we rely a lot on science and data. So we really try to promote a very objective change management strategy, using diversity, equity, and inclusion not as an afterthought or something that comes to mind after culture, but one of the pillars. So how do we approach change from a place where everyone is able to belong and feel part of that place? We are certified by the Society of HR Management, and we can also provide certification credits. We are a double minority certified company, and we are a certified partner of the Predictive Index. We do use multiple tools, but the Predictive Index is our preferred tool for organizational change because it's based on behavioral science. And to Joanna.
I love what you do. Thank you for sharing. A mad respect. I think the work is so needed. So, as she mentioned, I've been in HR for over 20 years and in the corporate space. So, that's where most of my experience comes from. I have my master's in HR and I have my DEI certification as well. And my passion point is really helping leaders discover themselves a little bit more and elevate their leadership skills so then they can really help elevate their teams. I think it's all intertwined. So there's a myriad of tools to do that, but honestly, connection, conversation, self-discovery, and authenticity are really what I use to make all that happen. So I'm excited to be here today with Adriana and chat and build our relationship a little bit more. This is fun.
Perfect. Thank you. A little bit about me, although this is not about me. I think sometimes it's weird to hear someone talk and you don't know what they've done. My experience started with project management, Six Sigma, numbers, and trying to really improve processes. I was very intentional on wanting processes that were very strong. And it wasn't until probably 5 years focusing on process when it kind of like hit me that you can have the best process that you can imagine, but if you don't have the buy-in of your people, if you don't have the motivation of your employees, if you don't have that culture and that environment and that cohesiveness, you don't achieve the results that you are looking for. And that, I think that's when my career started to move more towards people analytics and behavior and human resources. And that's how culture redesign started. I used to work in HR for large companies, and then I realized that culture, even though it was very important to me, I was doing so many things and so many things that were urgent, and dealing with workers' comp and lawsuits and fire and hire and train and onboard and all of these other things. That culture was something important to me, but not something I could dedicate my time to. And that's how the idea got started. I want to be that resource for business owners or HR leaders. I want to be your partner, really helping you create that better culture while you do everything else. That's sort of how this got started. So the relevance of DEI, and I have this slide on every single presentation because it's really important to me. I think diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, they're not skills that you master after 2 hours of training. I think they provide an outcome, and you can only enjoy or participate or see the benefits of that outcome once everyone is sort of adjusting their behavior. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging celebrates the importance of connection and authenticity. So we work on having better relationships in the workplace. And lastly, while it starts with awareness, it's not until we get to the place of behavior that we really accomplish a sustainable change initiative. I have a little bit of our execution framework here, not with the intention to board anyone, but just to share the fact that we do have a system on how we do things. So we start with that compelling case of the culture and that awareness of that vision that we have. What do we want the workplace to be like? And then we build a strategy and a plan to really sustain that change. And we are always thinking in terms of as if it was, a building. We work on the foundation, then we work on things that have to be in place for everyone to be able to live up to that change. And lastly, we think about all levels of the organization. I think when culture or leadership initiatives are in place only for executives, obviously change it doesn't really happen. It remains in a poster on the wall somewhere. And then when you only do the middle management, they're sort of stuck in the middle, communicating up and down. So I think part of the success, really, I believe firmly that you have to work with all people and different touch points so that everyone in the company feels that culture. And if an employee leaves and another employee comes in, that new employee is going to feel that coming through all different places, from management, from support staff, from supervisors, just everywhere.
Absolutely.
How do we create a strong infrastructure? We talk about having policies that support your culture. And I think I've seen two things happen. One is when a culture initiative is kind of like philosophical and romantic and aspirational, and it makes everyone feel good for that one day event. And then the next Monday, everyone goes back to work and nothing changes, right? It was a great event, but nothing really changed in the workplace. And then the other one is when a culture initiative is put in place, and then independently, a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging initiative is put in place, and they're not talking to each other. I think while culture has particular elements, your core values, your beliefs, and your the ways you interact with employees, with leadership, with the community, those are pillars of your culture. But diversity, equity, and inclusion should also be part of those pillars from the beginning.
Absolutely.
KPIs, as I said, I'm big on numbers, and I know not everything can be objectively measured, but at least culture and DEI initiatives should improve your employee retention, and definitely attracting more talent, especially right now. In terms of onboarding strategies, I think teaching an employee what the job entails is very important, but also teaching them about the culture is equally as important. And lastly, I think professional development and coaching is an element that should be present in every company, because that's how you develop your leaders of tomorrow, and that's really how you learn more about different individuals when you are spending time with them and understanding where what career path they want to take. Actually, before I move from here, I want to see what Joanna wants to share, because this is actually her expertise. So my expertise is culture. You want to change your culture, I'm here. But how to make that change stick and stay, that's where Joanna comes in. What do you think about those three brackets that I have in there?
They're pivotal. And I'm so glad you touched on each one. And I like that you mentioned how the first one, sometimes people get together and everybody's really excited about it. And then they come back on Monday and everything's back to how it was before, right? And I call those like emotional gatherings. It's like we really want everybody to feel good, feel it. It's great. Yay. But nothing is really sticking because we're not discussing really how this is going to manifest in the day-to-day life. And I think that's where the policies, the governance, KPIs, the strategies, all those pieces come into play to really make all that happen. So I think culture and HR are intertwined and are very important to work together. But like we were chatting the other day, it's important to have everything talking to each other, right? So when you mentioned about DEI, DIB, I know people are adding different letters nowadays, but first of all, it's important to define what diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging means to that organization realistically, and then making sure that all the DIB policies or strategies really align with any cultural processes that we want to bring to life, and that the policies align with that. So for example, when we talk about DEI, sometimes it's really listed as its own entity just by itself, and it shouldn't be. It really needs a seat with everything else because everything needs to talk to each other. So just like finance is creating their strategies to support the overall objectives for the company, marketing is doing that as well. So is DEI, right? So is HR. So all the departments, so to speak, need to speak to each other and really align to bring the company objectives to life, which is, hey, we want to make money, we want to get everybody paid, benefits, that's great. But then also have a culture that really speaks to the people that are there and retains the talent. I mean, ultimately, that's the goal for having all that culture. So I'm glad all of this is intertwined and makes sense. And we could go on and on and on and on.
I just thought of something when you were talking about having a seat, and I just want your opinion because you also come from HR. So I think your opinion and my opinion could be biased, but I'm not sure here.
Maybe.
Do you think DEI, for companies that have a DEI department, do you think that should be under the umbrella of HR, or do you think that should be an independent department? Just like finance and marketing. I mean, they all work together, but what's your take on reporting to HR or not reporting to HR?
I have mixed feelings on it. I think that many companies, especially in 2020, launched DEI departments, and now they're folding them into HR. And it can have mixed results because ultimately the resources needed for DEI could be diluted or not existent. But then also when DEI was on its own, it still was not getting all the resources and the funding that is needed. So I'm more like, where does DEI need to sit so it gets the resources and funding that it needs to actually make results happen? So most of the time, the DEI department is a party of one. And I'm like, one person underfunded, under-resourced is not going to change the organization.
Right.
It's impossible. So like, where do you want DEI to sit so that it gets the resources, the funding, the people to really make the results happen? So if you need to put it under HR to make that happen, okay. If you want it to sit independently so it can have it, then great. Ultimately, though, it needs to be a big voice, and DEI needs to be threaded through all the departments. It's not just a standalone entity. So that's where it's like mixed. People want it to be on its own, and I get that to an extent, but it's important for everybody at the table to view their strategies through a DEI lens so they don't miss things.
Right.
And I think that's where there's the opportunity. So you still have maybe marketing working siloed and not using a DEI lens really when they're designing their marketing strategies to make sure that they're capturing all of the populations that they can for their product or services, right? Even HR can be guilty of not using a DEI lens, believe it or not, depending on who's in the seat. Do they really think about the different backgrounds that are at work, even benefits? Sometimes people don't even use a DEI lens there. Something as simple as like, bereavement leave for miscarriages, right? It's a benefit that some companies don't offer. And it's like, okay, are you viewing your benefits through a DEI lens to be inclusive of women and the loss that they go through? So those are some thoughts that come to mind when it's like, should it sit separate or on its own? And ultimately, I want it to get funding, resources, and staff to
Right.
make changes happen.
Excellent, thank you. My next question is, how can companies deliver on their promise of creating safe spaces for everyone? I think that those conversations about psychological safety are sometimes reduced to a training session, but how do we really create that safe space?
Oh yeah, psychological safety. It's almost become overused, just like some DI and some of these other words, and people haven't really spent time defining what it means. So I almost don't even want to use psychological safety as much because I can't force someone to feel safe. But what I can do is create an environment where bravery is celebrated. And by that, I mean, when you peel it back with psychological safety, it's really boiling down to fear and lack of courage or bravery. And so when we think about it from that lens, it's like, how do we empower people, to feel more courageous and brave in holding people accountable, in speaking up when something's not right? And then what tools are we giving them? Because for a lot of people, depending on their background or how they were raised, speaking up is not a thing. You just don't do that, right? And so we need to get sometimes a little bit more granular in how to do it. So if you're in a meeting, I've seen these being shared now more often. If you're in a meeting and a man interrupts a woman, how should you handle it, right? Or if somebody does a microaggression in front of you, how can you handle it? So I think having those granular conversations are very helpful because not everyone understands or knows how to be more courageous in a business setting. It's new to a lot of people. And frankly, our culture nowadays is all about our phone, right? Let's all text and and so we're losing that interpersonal skill, how to really communicate with people. So when I think about safety, it's like, how do we really equip leaders to be more courageous in the moment or, right after, how to handle these situations. So it's not just, oh, let's talk about microaggressions as an example. It's what are microaggressions? Because what I may think is a microaggression, you may not even realize is a microaggression, right? So let's talk about that. Let's define it a little bit more. And then how can we address it? And if people are saying, well, I can't speak up, then the culture needs to be modified, right? It needs to become a culture that embraces more courage, that people don't really cringe every time, you're sharing some feedback and holding people accountable. So feedback is the other one. Like, how do you hold, even in performance conversations, right? People aren't comfortable even giving performance feedback to their direct reports in some settings. So it's boiling down to bravery,
Right.
and the tools with that.
I love what you say of like how how do we do it, like those granular conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think bias training, microaggression training, like the conceptual training is maybe a step one, but once you have that information, people might still going through microaggressions and not say anything.
Oh no.
So how do we create that environment in a positive way so that change is actually a possibility? So my next question, how can leaders develop competencies to support and champion a culture transformation?
Ooh, that's a big question.
See, I thought of this question.
I know, so good. I did want to add another point to the previous one, which was around vulnerability.
Okay.
And so sometimes when leaders are vulnerable in sharing their own opportunities, then it helps create a culture where it's more comfortable to give feedback, share feedback, hold people accountable, because it humanizes the leader. They don't look like there's so much up there in this pedestal. It's like, no, we're in this together. So vulnerability helps with creating safe spaces, or safer spaces, I should say. When it comes down for leaders, there are so many resources available that I'm shocked sometimes that leaders aren't really leveraging them. I mean, I think it's almost like too many resources, but it's interesting. Sometimes I've worked with leaders and I ask, like, well, what book have you read this year, to help you with your leadership growth, or podcast, or TED Talk, or, article, any organization? And the answer is like, well, I don't have time. And they haven't. And I'm like, you do realize that your direct reports are making time and evolving themselves, right? And so if you as a leader don't make time to grow yourself, your team outgrows you from a leadership standpoint, because they're expanding their toolkit, whereas you're not. And that's a huge mess. So I think with all the resources available, I'm gonna pick one and do it. But
I love that. I actually feel like I'm always thinking, what else can I give you? Well, like, what else can I do for you? But you're putting it right on them. What are you gonna do? So that's the lesson of the day. I love that.
yeah, because if they're not going to make the time, then no matter how many tools we give them, it's not going to happen. So I like to rewind the conversation a little bit to, why is it important for you to grow yourself as a leader? What can you gain out of it? And that way they understand, like, the importance basically of growing themselves. And I find that more like as you get higher in middle management and then executive leadership, like, there's less and less time, frankly, dedicated to leadership growth. And you probably need it more as you grow higher, because the skills are more nuanced now as you're dealing with higher level leaders. So I think it's important for you to make time to grow yourself. And get a coach.
Right.
I mean, there's plenty of coaches out there, so obviously vet them out to based, on what your preferences are and what you need. But I think having a leadership coach is very helpful. Mentors are great, and I think leaders should have a mentor. That's fantastic, and I talk about that when I do my personal advisory board presentation. But people are putting a lot of emphasis on mentorship. And it's like sometimes you need a coach. You need somebody who's really going to tell you what you need to do and hold you accountable to it. And I think when you're dealing with middle management and executives, it's a matter of time and accountability. So a coach is more impactful in, okay, let's agree on the resources that we're going to use and the opportunities that you have, and let's drive some accountability so we see some change and some progress. So based on like an example is based on everything that happened in 2020. I mean, as a leader, it's your priority to really understand DEI, right? It's
Right.
very important. How do you treat your people? How do you create an inclusive environment? So here we are in 2023. If you haven't read anything on it or viewed anything on it, you're really behind, right? So it's like stay up to speed
Right.
with everything.
The next one, I've done it both ways, but I want to know your take on it. Do you recommend reviewing policies and procedures before a new culture has been rolled out or after? So do you do the design, then you roll it out, and then you review policies, or you create all the infrastructure first, then roll it out with the new policies that are supporting that culture?
Mm, can we do both? Uh,
Simultaneously?
yeah, I feel like as you're designing the culture, which is very important work, there needs to also be a discussion of what tools, policies, processes are needed to um, not just launch that cultural change, but maintain it and sustain it. So it's almost like you can start the discussions around culture, that initial work, yes, to kind of get more thoughts flowing as to the vision and what we want to create from a cultural standpoint. But then before we get too far in the process, those policies and processes need to start getting reviewed, because sometimes the policies can either support or take away from the culture. So let's say we're trying to create obviously a more inclusive culture, where we may have policies that are a little bit outdated that need to be modified to really support an inclusive culture. Processes, right? Practices. That's really what I want to dig into, because we have all of our policies on paper and our processes on paper, but what are the practices? What are people actually doing? Like when people say, well, this is what the policy says, but I do it this way.
Right.
And so that's the stuff that we want to bring to the surface, those practices, because that can really impact the progress of culture.
Correct.
So that's why I feel like it's like culture can start, and then you need those procedures to be like, okay, let's come in here and help build this up and sustain it in the day-to-day, and talk about these practices that are actually taking place, so we can make those go away and really support the cultural design.
Perfect. So in the current landscape of the workplace, do you believe that organizational culture still has a strong impact on turnover rate? And I'm asking that because I see companies putting effort into culture and employees still living for, like living that job for $5,000 a year more, or, a lesser commute, different reasons. And with different generations, different things are priority. So what do you see as the role of culture right now?
culture is still very important, but I think that we cannot take away the other elements, right? So, especially when we're speaking with younger generations, I had to have this conversation with a leader about younger generations have a tendency to leave jobs in 2 to 3 years. And so I think instead of viewing that as a negative or being offended, just embrace it. It's part of the generation, and we can't change that. Um, that's just that's in their DNA, and it's frankly because they have seen older generations stay at companies for years, and they don't get anything for that loyalty. So it's not like every year that you're with a company you get a loyalty bonus. You know, every year you get your review, and you may get like a 2 to 3% increase. So that's just being practical, right? And so people have seen that now, and they realize, you know what, is there's really isn't a true financial benefit to staying with a company for many, many years. Now, it doesn't mean that professional development, investment, and coaching can't help with that. So an employee will stay with a company if they can see their path growing and they're being invested upon for that growth. So that piece I think is very important when it comes down to culture design. So I think people want to focus on culture as like all the feel good stuff. And it's like, well, there's practical reasons why people are leaving. Like,
Right.
money is a factor. So something else that needs to be looked at is compensation. And some companies are reluctant to do that. But is your compensation truly competitive in the current market? Is your benefits package truly relevant and attractive to people? Is it inclusive of everyone that you have on your team and people that you want to bring in? Because those are all factors that can help people stay with a company, come to a company and then stay with a company, right? But I think we have this misnomer that, oh, we want people to stay with us for like a decade and 20 years. And I'm like, oh, no. Like, I don't think that's the norm now. The norm is
Right.
less.
I agree that's not the norm, especially with younger generations. But I've noticed that sometimes when they, even after leaving, they might be that recruiter for you. They might talk about
Yeah.
how great their experience was there.
Yes.
And I feel like that is just as good, like, yes, of
Absolutely.
course you want to retain, but if it's not on the DNA of that generation to stay for a really long time at a job, at least getting that positive review or having them talking about how great the culture is, I think that means a lot.
Oh,
um
absolutely. Absolutely. Because they're going to go marketing at your company wherever they go.
right.
So I think having that great culture is still very important. But I think instead of tying, having a great culture means having people stay with us for many years, let's tie a great culture to, you know what, the people that are here love working here, and the people that leave have great things to say about us.
Right. I want to open it up in case someone has a question while I read my last question. When a client says to you, I don't know where to start, what should I do first? I can only do one thing. I have only budget for one thing. What is your immediate, like, just do this one thing? If that's the only thing you can do, which one would you say?
Oof, one thing. Um, I think I like to focus on leadership development because I think at the end of the day, no matter what processes, strategies, whatever we come up with, it has to be executed by leaders. And leaders need to be fully versed and fully on board. And so their growth is very important. Their development is very important to the success of the company.
Okay.
So
We do have
start
one
there.
question. How do you usually, or how do you recommend that we track employee engagement?
Oh, employee engagement. Uh, I'm a big fan of stay discussions. I know we like to call them state interviews sometimes, but you're not trying to hire them for a position. It's a discussion that really should be kept alive throughout the year. It's like, why are you staying here? And what could I do better as your leader? What can the company do better? What are the pain points that you're experiencing? And doing something about it. So I know companies use engagement surveys, and they're great if you do something with the information. So I think many times we do the engagement survey and we don't even communicate the results to employees, much less communicate what we're doing about the results. So if that happens year after year, it just erodes trust. And people don't want to really truly share their feedback because nothing is being done about it. So I feel there's multiple ways of gathering information from your current employees to see what's working well, what could be better. And we need to handle that. We need to address it, or at least let them know, like, okay, I read that you have this concern about us. We cannot address it right now, but it's on our radar. So maybe we could tackle in 2024. Employees can accept that. I don't think we give them enough credit. Like, an employee values that transparency. Like, okay, great. At least I was heard. At least it was noted. And it's on your radar. And I understand if there's no budget for it right now. But we need to communicate. So I'm a big fan of state discussions on a regular basis. So we really understand what's going on.
I love the next question because it almost ties really well to this one. What do you suggest if a leader will not support professional development for team members because they have no interest in growing themselves?
Ah!
That's a toughie.
I'm a big fan of frank conversations with people. So obviously that leader would be reporting to someone. So that person would probably be responsible for having that conversation. But it's really about, well, why do you feel that you do not need any development yourself? And some leaders feel this way because they have not gotten constructive feedback throughout their tenure. So they feel they're amazing. And meanwhile, their team is like, we have thoughts that you need to change. And so I think those frank conversations need to really happen to share that constructive feedback. And, well, these are the opportunities that we're seeing. And this is why we think this is important for you to have this development. And we are going to do it in tandem with the team members because everyone needs growth and development. So I have been in situations in companies where we've had to, I hate to use the word force, but we've had to move forward because it's a necessity. And then as we've gone through it, the person has understood the value in it because they're seeing the transformation. And accountability plays a factor in that. So of course, there's a saying out there that what doesn't get measured is not going to change, right? So if we think that leadership development is so important, what KPIs can we attach to that? Would be another approach. I don't particularly want to go there right out the gate. I like to have the conversation and see if we can persuade, but some people only understand KPIs, so we have to go that route. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but.
It does. We have someone wrote an observation and I want to read it because it is relevant. Employees have moved between companies for decades in California because California removed the roadblocks to live in, contractual restrictions on where you can move, non-compete agreements. A lot of states have had non-compete clauses in the hiring documents. And in Massachusetts, we do have a lot of different clauses. In terms of industry, there are different for salespeople. So I do agree that plays a factor. And then his last comment was, I have experienced this from both sides, even in states that have made non-compete illegal. That is a great observation. I have, I like to stay on track because I said 45 minutes, but I want to quote something you said because I wrote it down. And I thought it was really nice. You said create an environment where bravery is celebrated. And I think that should be a postcard everywhere. I think we talk a lot about training, but we don't tell people how to really put those like that training in place and into practice. Lastly, I want to just thank everyone. This was very nice for me. It's, always good to have a live conversation, and I love that we had questions from the audience. But I want to give you a couple of minutes to tell people where can they find you, how can they interact with you, how can they connect with you.
Thank you so much. It's been a really fun conversation. It's like we can geek out on,
Yes.
So I can be found on LinkedIn. Joanna Coco Kemper is my profile, and on there I have information about the services I offer, which are leadership coaching, leadership development. I'm also a speaker and a facilitator of different courses. So if you have any interest in those, please reach out to me via LinkedIn. And my email is at joanna@jckleadershipgrowth.com.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for attending. I will follow up with an email with Joanna's information as well, so everyone gets it there and the deck. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.